All right, guys. Hello, and today I'm just going to do a little video going over a man named Richard Nixon, President of the United States, and some actions that he carries out that eventually will lead to his impeachment. Um, I'm also using a new kind of app on the computer where I'll be able to write notes um, down as I am talking. So that should, be able to help you out a little bit. Okay. So if you look at the screen right here, I'll make it bigger in a sec. um, we're talking about President Nixon, all right? And Nixon ran his whole campaign was based on the promise that the United States was going to take soldiers out of Vietnam. Um, Many U.S. citizens were angry that we were fighting in Vietnam, and he used that as his promise. If you elect me as president, I will get American soldiers home. He won that election, became president of the United States, and did start to slowly take American soldiers out of Vietnam. However, uh, he got military intelligence that the NVA had their headquarters about 15 miles into Cambodia, and he believed that was knowledge that he could use to really turn the war in the U.S. favor. So he ordered American soldiers into Cambodia. This is a problem because now we're kind of invading another country that is neutral in this war. Um, U.S. citizens find out, and there are protests all over United States cities and colleges. People were not trusting the government or the president, um, and this leads to real tense situations in the United States. That distrust is going to be increased even more when a man named Daniel Ellsberg, who works for a newspaper, um, gets information, secret information, about the Vietnam War. He gets access to these secret documents, and the documents are proving that the government is lying about the Vietnam War. That they're saying that the United States is winning the war when really, in fact, it's kind of a stalemate. He puts all these documents into something called the Pentagon Papers. And the Pentagon Papers are then put and published in the New York Times, and this gets out all across this country that the United States government is lying about the war. They're not being truthful. So this just increases that level of uh, distrust for the government and for President Nixon. Nixon is extremely angry that these Pentagon Papers were published. It makes him look bad. It makes the United States government and military look bad. So he is going to do some actions after this event that are going to lead to his impeachment. Okay. Now, what is going to happen here is Nixon wants to get revenge on Daniel Ellsberg. He does not want people to believe that Daniel Ellsberg is a credible man. So he actually orders people that work for him to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, and try to find any dirt, files that contain information that will make Daniel Ellsberg look, like a bad guy, immoral, or something like that. All right, so that's kind of the first thing that Nixon does here that is really bad, right? So Nixon orders his men to break into the this, I'm gonna spell this wrong. You guys know I can't spell. Psychiatrist office of Ellsberg. Right? The reason why he wants to get info that will make Ellsberg unreliable, right? Right. Nixon wants Daniel Ellsberg to be discredited. That way, people might not believe, that the Pentagon Papers are actually full of accurate information, right? So what happens next is it turns out that there really were no files in the psychiatrist's office about Ellsberg. So this was really a waste of time for Nixon. Doesn't get anything that he needs. A couple months go by, and Nixon is trying to get reelected as president again. And Nixon wants not only to win this election, he wants to win in a landslide. He wants to crush the Democratic nominee, right? So what happens here is something called Watergate. Okay, when you think or hear the word Watergate, you're going to think of President Nixon. Okay, Watergate is President Nixon's downfall. Okay. Okay. Now, what happens at Watergate is people that work for President Nixon know that he wants to win this election by a landslide. So they decide, without getting permission from him, that they are going to break into a building called Watergate, and inside that building are offices that belong to the Democratic Committee, right? The Democratic National Committee is in charge of helping get the Democratic nominee elected as president. So Nixon's men believe that if they break into these offices, they could get secret information on the Democratic nominees, and Nixon can use that to his advantage to make his opponents look terrible, right? So what happens is they break into the office and they put surveillance microphones into the office, right? And break in, and we'll call tap the office. Okay. So they tap the office, and it actually they are now able to listen from afar and listen to all the conversations that are going on in the offices. Okay. After a couple weeks, it actually turns out that some of the surveillance technology isn't working. So the men go back into the offices. This time they get caught and they are arrested. Okay. Obviously, this is a crime. You're breaking and entering. You are also surveilling and taping the Democratic National Convention. This is not allowed. Okay. Now, President Nixon is very anxious about this because it turns out, and he finds out, that these men uh, are actually connected to his office, right? Nixon himself did not actually tell these men to break in, but Nixon's people ordered them to do it. Okay. Um, so Nixon's afraid that if this gets out into the press, this will make him look bad even more, and it will lead to even more distrust, right? So Nixon is going to start doing things here that are going to lead to his impeachment. Okay. Now, what he does is, because he wants to keep this information from getting out, he's actually willing to pay $1 million to the burglars to keep them quiet, to make sure they don't testify that they were part of Nixon's men, right? Um, it also turns out that Nixon finds out these men were the same person who he had told to break into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, right? So he's afraid that if these men start talking about Watergate, they might also bring up the fact that Nixon had them break into the psychiatrist's office, right? So he's willing to pay these men $1 million to keep them quiet, so they don't talk about breaking into the psychiatrist's office as well. Okay, all right. So that is what is going to be bad here as well, right? He hold on. Here we go. Okay, so Nixon pays the burglars $1 million to keep quiet, right? So that's a problem. Then it also turns out that President Nixon had also put microphones in his own office in the White House. He did this because he wanted to eventually write like a book about his time as president. So it would allow him to have lots of information for his book. Turns out that the Senate finds out about these tapes, and they want to know, what President Nixon was talking about in his office. Did he know? They want to know? Did President Nixon order this to happen? And they figured that information would probably be on the tapes. So they order Nixon to hand over his tapes. Okay. And Nixon refuses to do it. Okay. Now, why does he refuse? Right? If he has nothing to hide, why does he refuse? Eventually, Nixon does hand over the tapes, and it turns out that 18 minutes of a particular tape were erased, right? And years later, a man testified that the 18 minutes that were erased were Nixon telling him that they need to keep this quiet. to get the burglars to keep their mouth shut, and to go to jail, and they'll be paid. Um, so that kind of shows that Nixon is trying to cover up this whole thing. Okay. Now, Nixon is going to be impeached by the House, and eventually, so Nixon is going to be impeached, right? Okay. The reason why he's impeached, right, is because he is trying to cover up the break-in at Watergate, right? He did not actually order them to break in and do it, but when he found out, he was trying to cover it up because he didn't want it to get back to him. Right? He refused to hand over the tapes. Okay. And the House votes to impeach President Nixon, and then it actually turned out that the Senate was going to remove him from office. Right now, this is different than what happened a couple months ago with President Trump. The House voted to impeach him, but then the Senate ruled against it. Right, the Senate was not going to remove him. Right, but in this case, for President Nixon, the Senate was going to remove him from office. Okay. To prevent that from happening, from being the first president to ever be removed from office, Nixon resigns as president, right? Becoming the first and only president to ever step down as president of the United States. Okay. So this whole incident, known as Watergate, Nixon is always going to be remembered for this incident, right? He wanted to win so badly that he was, having his men break into psychiatrist offices to get dirt on political opponents. And then the men that actually worked for him hired people to break into the Democratic National Convention buildings so they could get dirt on the nominee for the Democrats. Then Nixon's issue with this whole Watergate incident is that he tried to cover it up, right? If he didn't try to cover it up, he wouldn't have gotten in trouble at all. But because he obstructed justice and got in the way, refused to hand over the tapes, bribed these men with millions of dollars to keep quiet, that is where Nixon got in trouble. Okay, and after this incident, the American people are even more not trustful of their political leaders. Right? Okay, so I know that was quite a few notes and everything for you guys, but I just want to show you a quick little video scene from a movie called Forrest Gump. Okay, now in this scene, I don't know if you guys ever seen the movie, but Forrest Gump is has slight mental problems, and Forrest Gump is able to travel, all over the world, you could say. And let's see if I can get this to play. So just watch this scene. It's kind of funny.
Team met with President Nixon today at an Oval Office ceremony.
A few months later, they invited me and the ping pong team to visit the White House. So I went again. And I met the President of the United States again. Only this time they didn't get us rooms in a real fancy hotel.
So are you enjoying yourself in our nation's capital?
Right, President Nixon, right
Where
there.
are you staying? It's called the Hotel Ebot. Oh, no. I know of a much nicer hotel. It's brand new, very modern. I'll have my people take care of it for you.
Yeah, sir. You might want to send a maintenance man over to that office across the way. The lights are off and they must.
All right, so this office right here is supposed to be the Watergate offices, um, where the Democratic National Committee's offices are, right? So the burglars actually broke in the second time in the middle of the night, right?
We look for a fuse box or something because them flashlights, they're keeping me awake. Thank you. Good night.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
So, kind of funny that they put that into this movie. All right. So I hope this video helps you. I know it was a little long, but so be it. All right. Bye.